In 1971, a mock prison turned ordinary students into sadists and sheep, or did it? New evidence suggests the most famous study of evil was actually a carefully staged performance. By the end of this video, you will understand why the Stanford Prison Experiment tells us less about human nature and more about the power of bad science. The story goes like this. Philip Zimbardo, a Stanford psychologist, wanted to test what happens when good people are placed in a bad situation. He recruited 24 psychologically healthy male students, randomly assigned them to be guards or prisoners, and set up a fake prison in the basement of the psychology building. The experiment was supposed to last 2 weeks. It stopped after 6 days. Why? Because the guards became sadistic. They forced prisoners to sleep on the floor, cleaned toilets with their bare hands, and subjected them to humiliating rituals. Prisoners broke down. Some even showed psychosomatic rashes. Zimbardo concluded that the situation, not individual personality, turned ordinary men into oppressors. That conclusion became a cornerstone of social psychology. It appears in textbooks, documentaries, and TED Talks. But what if the whole thing was rigged? The problem starts with how the guards were instructed. Zimbardo held a briefing for guards just before the study began. He told them that the prisoners would try to revolt and that they must be prepared. He said, "We cannot physically abuse them, but we can make them feel bored, frustrated, and scared." That sounds like a subtle nudge toward brutality, but there is more. The guards also received explicit instructions on how to behave from the prison superintendent, a role played by Zimbardo himself. He told them to create a sense of powerlessness. One guard later admitted that he thought the researchers wanted them to act tough. This is a textbook case of demand characteristics. The participants were not just spontaneously becoming cruel. They were following what they believed the experiment required. Consider the famous scene where guards force prisoners to chant the prison song while cleaning toilets. That did not happen organically. Zimbardo, acting as superintendent, suggested it to the guards. He gave them scripts. He told them to increase harassment. So the guards obediently performed the role of evil guards because the authority figure told them to. This is not evidence of the situation corrupting ordinary people. It is evidence that people follow orders from an experimenter. The real lesson is about obedience to authority, not about the inherent evil of roles. And then there is the issue of selection bias. Zimbardo advertised for volunteers with an ad that offered $15 a day for a 2-week study of prison life. But the ad also said, "We are looking for volunteers who are mature, emotionally stable, and opposed to physical violence." That last phrase is strange. Why mention opposition to violence unless you expect violence might occur? Then Zimbardo's screening process included a personality test, but he deliberately selected participants who were low in aggression and authoritarianism. He wanted to show that even the most psychologically normal people become abusive. But even with that filter, only about a third of the guards actually engaged in abusive behavior. The rest were neutral or even kind. One guard nicknamed John Wayne was the worst, but he later admitted he was just acting. He said he had studied acting in college and thought that was what Zimbardo wanted. So the most famous guard performance was just that, a performance. The prisoners also played along. Many of them had read Lord of the Flies before the experiment. They knew the stereotype of prison. One prisoner later said, "I knew I was supposed to become depressed and helpless." So he did. The famous Prisoner 819 breakdown scene where he screamed and cried and had to be removed was partially staged for the cameras. The New York Times photographer was present. Zimbardo later admitted that he told the guards to be more aggressive for the benefit of the photographer. The entire event was not a natural emergence of evil. It was a production, complete with costumes, scripts, and a stage manager. Now think about how the experiment ended. The common narrative says it was halted when Christina Maslach, Zimbardo's girlfriend and a recent PhD, saw the prisoners being marched to the bathroom with bags over their heads and was horrified. She told Zimbardo it was unethical and he ended it. That is true, But MacLeod's objection was not about the abuse per se. She was one of the few people who saw the experiment from the outside. Most observers, including Zimbardo, were caught up in the performance. They believed they were observing real behavior, but MacLeod saw actors. She later said that Zimbardo himself was more disturbed than the participants. He had lost objectivity. So the experiment was stopped because of an ethical concern, but also because the experimenter had become part of the fiction. What does this mean for the widely taught lesson? The Stanford Prison Experiment has been used to explain everything from Abu Ghraib to school bullying. The idea that the situation can make anyone a torturer is powerful, but it is not supported by the data. A more rigorous replication of the experiment, done by the BBC in 2002, found that guards did not automatically become abusive. Instead, prisoners developed a collective identity and resisted. The experimenters had to step in to prevent the prisoners from forming a rebellion. The BBC study showed that roles are not deterministic. People bring their own beliefs and behaviors into any situation. There is also a deeper problem with Zimbardo's interpretation. He argued that the prison situation overwhelmed individual personalities, but his own behavior suggests that the situation of being an experimenter can also corrupt. Zimbardo acted as superintendent, which gave him power over both guards and prisoners. He coached guards, allowed abusive behavior, and did not stop it until an outsider arrived. That is not a neutral observation of a situation. That is an active manipulation. The experiment was not a passive exploration of human nature. It was a demonstration of how a charismatic authority figure can create a reality that participants then inhabit. So what is the real lesson? It is not that anyone can become evil. It is that people are remarkably good at following scripts, especially when they believe those scripts are sanctioned by experts. The participants in the Stanford Prison Experiment were not revealing their true selves. They were performing for an audience, the researcher. That is why the experiment has such a durable legacy. It is a gripping story, but it is a story, and stories do not need to be true to be taught. They need to be compelling. The Stanford Prison Experiment is compelling because it confirms our darkest suspicions about ourselves. But the evidence suggests those suspicions are misplaced. The human mind is not a passive vessel for situational pressures. It is a meaning-making machine. When you put people in a novel situation, they look for cues about how to behave. If the cues say act cruel, some will. But if the cues say resist, others will. The problem with Zimbardo's experiment is that the cues were not subtle. They were explicit. He told the guards to be tough. He told them the prisoners would revolt. He even gave them specific techniques. And the guards, being normal people, followed orders. This is not a trivial point. It shifts the blame from the situation to the authority that defines the situation. When we focus on the situation, we imply that any system can corrupt. That absolves the individuals who design the system. The Stanford Prison Experiment was designed to prove a point, and it did. But the point it proved was about the power of the experimenter, not the power of the prison. And that is the unlearned lesson. When we watch the grainy footage of guards with sunglasses and nightsticks, we think we are seeing the fragility of human decency. What we are actually seeing is the fragility of scientific rigor. The experiment was a masterpiece of theater, but poor science. Zimbardo convinced the world that he had discovered something about human nature. In reality, he had discovered something about his own ability to stage a drama. The question that remains is why we keep telling this story. Why does a flawed experiment with a sample size of 24 continue to dominate our understanding of evil? Perhaps because it is easier to believe that ordinary people can be turned into monsters than to accept that some people choose cruelty and that most people, even under immense pressure, do not. The Stanford Prison Experiment gives us a comfortable fiction. It says the bad guy is the situation, not the person. But if the situation itself is staged by a person, then we are back to individual responsibility. So the next time someone references the Stanford Prison Experiment to explain why good people do bad things, ask them how many guards actually acted cruelly. Ask them who gave the orders. Ask them whether the guards and prisoners were simply following a script written by a director. The answer will not change the textbook, but it might change how you think about the stories we tell ourselves about human nature. The most famous study of evil was, in the end, a performance. And the real lesson is not about the darkness inside us. It is about how easily we can be made to play a role, especially when we trust the person holding the script. That is a lesson worth remembering, but not the one Zimbardo intended.